Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia SQ-80-V tutorial series. Today we're dealing with a couple of sections. We're going to deal with voice and filter. Just before we set off on that, if I can point you at the Patreon link in the description below, that's a really great way to help support my channel if you're enjoying this content. Alternatively, you can press the join button to become a YouTube channel member. Huge thanks to everybody who has, I really appreciate it. Now, I've dialed back up my simple sawtooth wave preset. And we're going to deal with the voice section first. Starting from left to right, this is a nice easy one, mono. This is really easy to see. If I switch briefly to keyboard mode, press a key down, press a second key down, you only hear one note at a time. I can let go of that C, you're not hearing the C anymore. So basically in mono mode, you only ever hear one key at a time, as opposed to plays both of those notes simultaneously. And that's it for the really simple stuff. From this point onwards, we need to understand how the voice architecture of this synthesizer works. We're going to be basically talking about reassign, but a wider conversation about unison and voicing. This synthesizer is capable of generating 16 independent voices simultaneously. Now, a voice can contain multiple different sounds because voices contain multiple different oscillators. But basically, if you imagine everything that you can see on screen there as the representation of what a voice can do, you can have 16 of those running simultaneously. So theoretically, you could play a 16-note chord. Who does that? Generally speaking, what voices are used for instead is to enable the synthesizer to play the same note multiple times if they overlap. And this happens with release cycles, for instance. If one key is still releasing and gradually fading away and you press the same key again, you need multiple voices to be able to handle that. And there's also a feature called Unison, which we'll get onto shortly. And the reason I'm introducing the concept of voices at the moment is because this is what reassign is all about. What happens when we press the same key multiple times? A really nice way to demonstrate reassign is to give ourselves a really long release period. Now we'll deal with the envelope in the next episode, but just for now, accept that all I've done there is made this note last longer. When I press the key and let go, you hear it tail away nicely. Now what I'm going to do is press that key repeatedly multiple times. You hear once I press that second note, you start to get interactions between multiple different notes. That's the synthesizer using all of its voices, all of its available voices, to satisfy any demand it can. If you think of it like a first in, first out basis, that if I'm playing 8 notes, then the 9th note is going to throw away the first note. And when reassign is off, that's the standard behavior. The synth will use as many voices as it can to play that note repeatedly. If I engage reassign, it will only ever use one voice to play one note. Now you're going to hear a difference. Every single time I hit that key, even though it wants to extend off into the release cycle, it's being truncated, because the moment I press the same key again, it throws that old voice away and starts playing the new note with the same voice. So you never hear two notes, two identical pitched notes using different voices. A good example of a sound where you might want to engage the reassign feature is if you were emulating a piano. Every piano key can only ever be hit once. It's a hammer physically hitting the string. That string can't be made to vibrate multiple different times. And so if you press that piano key again, all you're doing is throwing the old note away and starting to play the new one. That's what the reassign button is emulating. Unison is a twist on polyphony, whereby the synthesizer can use multiple different voices to play a single note at a single time. So now that I've engaged Unison, you go down to the bottom window down here and you can see that Unison is currently set to 2, which means every time I press a key on the keyboard, it's going to use 2 different voices to generate that single note. Furthermore, notes in Unison mode are detuned against each other. And interestingly, in this particular synthesizer, the notes can't be made to play exactly at the same pitch. So even at its lowest setting at 0.1%, there's going to be some detune between these two notes. I'll set it back to its default, which is 30%, but I'll press a note on the keyboard. Listen to the interaction between the two notes. You can even see it in the spectrum analyzer and the oscilloscope actually. those two notes are basically playing against each other because they're at different pitches. So you're getting different ranges of constructive and destructive interference between those waves, creating really complex shapes. Unison can be absolutely gorgeous if it's dialed down. If I bring this down to about 5%, you get a much more subtle effect, and it can be really, really beautiful. So here's the thing with Unison. Those two voices are contributing towards the absolute maximum of 16. So I'm still fine, because at Unison level 2 I can still play 8 notes and not hit my synthesizer limit. But eventually I will, and there's an indication of this in the polyphony section down here. So this is basically controlling the maximum polyphony of the synthesizer, which defaults to 8, but it can go all the way up to 16. And look at this, half of it's greyed out. That's basically saying if you want to play 2 voices for every single note you play, the most notes that you can play is 8. If I increase Unison up to 4, now my polyphony is truncated down to 4, and also the rest of the settings are greyed out. And in fact, you'll get weird combinations as well. If I set my detune to 3, well, the maximum number of notes you can play that can satisfy that requirement is 5. 3 times 5 is 15, whereas 3 times 6 is 18 and blows the limit. Let's do a quick demonstration of polyphony, and just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to make things really, really easy. I'm going to take us back out of Unison mode, set the polyphony to 3. I'm going to play a bass note, in fact we'll see it, and then 3 higher notes, and as the 3rd high note comes in, you'll hear the bass note disappear. Pretty straightforward. Unless you're struggling for CPU, there's absolutely no reason to limit the polyphony on this synthesizer. Set it to 16 if your machine can handle it, but the default is 8. The 2 reset options are a little bit esoteric, and you're probably not going to need to deal with them very often. They're designed for fixing specific problems. We'll deal with reset oscillator first. What I'm going to do, I'm going to leave it off, and I'm going to press multiple C notes simultaneously or consecutively. So you're hearing the same note over and over again. That's because each of those notes that I'm playing, I just made my release a bit too long there. Each of those notes is basically in phase with each other. The oscillators in the background basically remember the last state that they were in, and when you press the note again, it remembers where it was and carries on from there. If we break that symmetry and we make every voice begin redrawing its wave from the absolute beginning, now if I press multiple notes consecutively again, all of those notes are going to be out of phase with each other. You're going to hear strange constructive patterns, and you're going to see lots of weird shapes in the analyzer. That's called comb filtering. You can see that the analyzer looks like the teeth of a comb because all of those waves are slightly out of phase with each other, and you're getting all sorts of constructive and destructive interference. To demonstrate reset envelope mode, I've had to change the envelope again. I've given myself a really long attack and a really long release. It takes absolutely ages on the release cycle now, because what's happening is that every time I press a note on the keyboard, it's going to remember, the synthesizer is going to remember its last envelope position. And so when I press that key again, it'll repeat that envelope. I'll press this note and let it get up to its maximum level. So we're now at the sustain point. Now I'm going to start pressing multiple keys. You can see the envelope wants to restart, but you can also see I'm kind of holding it at the sustain level because it's using its old envelope. The interface isn't really keeping up with what's going on here because there are multiple different envelopes, going on in the background. If I take all of that away and engage reset envelope mode, every single time I press a key, it's going to begin its envelope again, and you're going to hear you're going to hear silence, because even though this note's envelope is now at maximum, all of these subsequent notes that I press are all beginning their envelope from the absolute beginning. Not options you desperately need to worry about. They're frankly more confusing than useful very often. Just reloaded my simple saw preset. So we're back down to absolutely flat again so that I can demonstrate glide. This is basically, this is very often known as portamento. Let's press a couple of C's. Now introduce glide. We're going to take 0.3 seconds to slide from one note, to glide up from one note up to another, and back down again. I've got modulation options on this control, so let's click a plus button, assign it to our, let's say, mod wheel. Make sure that my mod wheel's at 0, and I'm going to dial some modulation amount in. Now, the center point where the white line is, that's your fixed point. You can see that we've got a modulation arc from that point extending onwards. You can have negative, but we've got a positive modulation here. So by default, it's going to take less than 0.2 of a second to get from one note to another. Increase my mod wheel to max. And now it's taking however long this little blue dot is indicating. It's about 4 seconds. If you engage glide and you play multiple notes simultaneously, all hell breaks loose because the synthesizer is basically constantly keeping track of the last note played. So it does all of the key tracking from that previous note. And get rid of all that. Now let's have a quick look at the filter section. The reason I've basically lumped this in with the voice section is because it's so simple, it's such a simple filter. We've got a really straightforward low pass filter with frequency cutoff and resonance. We can control each of those settings from our sliders, but we can also pick up the user interface. Your mouse disappears when you do, so it's a little bit disorienting, but basically they're achieving the same effect. Take all of this attack away so that we can actually hear what's going on. Really straightforward cutoff. Now there are secret interface buttons. There we go, found it. There are 2 of them. There we are. So these are modulation sources. So I can say, let's connect velocity to my filter cutoff. Basically, if I dial some of that in now, let's say that much. If I now pull my white slider down, see that pink bar is basically extending as I drag the scroll bar thumbnail. I get to the point where the pink line is just touching at its limit. I've now got the maximum extent of that filter velocity modulation. So if I press a note lightly, we're going to get a different filter effect than if I press it with greater velocity. Really nice that the user interface is updating. You also see this little blue line indicating the current filter level. The only other thing to say about the filter, because it really is that simple, is that we've got this keyboard tracking as well, filter keyboard tracking. Now, very often when you see keyboard, it's usually called key follow in synthesizers, it centers around a pivot point, like a seesaw. This doesn't, this is a linear scale. So effectively, your key center is, imagine it as C-2, that's not going to do you far wrong. The best way to demonstrate key follow or key tracking is for me to play some different notes on the keyboard and have a look at the spike. We've got a resonant spike here, and we can see that it's around about 800 Hertz. It doesn't matter what note I press on the keyboard, the filter spike is actually, there's not enough harmonics there to register, but it's always at 800 Hertz. The filter cutoff is always at the same frequency. When we introduce key tracking, that's no longer the case. If I dial some of this in, not too much so that it's absolutely outrageous, now play a range of different keys on the keyboard. So now the spike is at 1.1 kilohertz. There it is at 1.5-ish, 1.9. 2.4, 2.5, so it's tracking up the keyboard. The higher the note I press, the more adjustment is being made to the filter cutoff. So it is a sliding scale, but it's a linear sliding scale, essentially starting from the bottom of the keyboard. And that's it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.